The stench hit Eris Thorne first, before the screams, before the tearing of flesh. It was a cocktail of iron and ammonia, the metallic tang of fresh blood mingling with the acrid sting of bodily fluids expelled in agony, all underscored by the sickly sweet decay that clung to the air like a shroud. A smell that was rapidly becoming the signature scent of the apocalypse. He pulled his improvised respirator higher on his face, a useless gesture against the sheer, overwhelming assault on his senses. It was just a thin layer of activated carbon and treated fabric, meant for dust, not for the invisible miasma of death that saturated the air in the CDC's deepest sublevels. The security light above flickered, a dying gasp of a system struggling against the inevitable. It cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes, turning every stack of forgotten equipment into a lurking horror. Eris clutched the M4 carbine tighter, its familiar weight a cold comfort in the pit of his churning stomach. The recoil of the last burst still vibrated through his shoulders, a phantom echo of the moment he'd put down what was left of Dr. Jenkins, or rather, what Dr. Jenkins had become. Jenkins had been a colleague, a friend. Now he was just another snarling statistic, his face a ruined canvas of raw tissue and desperate hunger. Clear? The voice was a strained whisper, thick with fatigue and fear. It belonged to PFC Lena Hansen, barely out of basic training, but holding her own with a tenacity Eris hadn't expected. She huddled behind an overturned maintenance cart, her eyes wide, reflecting the flickering emergency light like a trapped animal. Her uniform, once pristine, was now streaked with grime, sweat, and something dark and viscous Eris didn't want to think about. For now, Eris rasped, his own voice hoarse. He pressed his back against the cold, damp concrete of the corridor wall. The air was thick and heavy, the ventilation system long dead. Every breath was a conscious effort, dragging in the putrid cocktail of fear and decay. He could taste it, a bitter, metallic film coating his tongue. His throat was dry, sandpaper rough. He swallowed, the effort a painful scrape. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. It hummed with unspoken dread, with the frantic thump of their own hearts against their ribs. It felt like the world had narrowed to this single suffocating corridor, every shadow a potential enemy, every distant groan a prelude to another wave. Eris risked a peek around the corner. The hallway stretched ahead, littered with debris. Overturned gurneys, discarded hazmat suits, shattered glass from what used to be a display cabinet. And then, the bodies. They were everywhere. Some still, broken and torn. Others, not so still. They twitched. They moaned. They scraped against the floor as their dead muscles contracted in spasms. A few even lifted their heads, vacant eyes slowly tracking the source of the minimal light, a deep, guttural growl rumbling in their chest. They weren't fast, not yet, but they were relentless, and their numbers were infinite. This was Sector C7, deep within the CDC's Atlanta facility, what was supposed to be the most secure containment zone on the planet, built to withstand biological threats on an unprecedented scale, designed to be a fortress. Now it was a tomb, and they were trapped in its bowels, two lone survivors trying to navigate the labyrinthine corridors back to a rumored evacuation point that Eris increasingly doubted existed. Movement, 12 o'clock. Hansen's voice was barely audible, but the urgency in it made Eris snap back. His gaze darted to where she was pointing with a trembling finger. It was a stretcher, on its side, and behind it, a low, rasping breath. Not the wheezing, wet sound of the standard infected, but something deeper, more guttural, something with a strange, almost methodical rhythm. Eris raised his M4, flicking the selector switch to semi-auto. Every round counted now. His magazine counter showed 18. Hansen had less, maybe 12 in her carbine and a few in her sidearm. They were running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. A shadow detached itself from the gloom behind the stretcher. It was a man, or what used to be one. Tall, gaunt, his lab coat shredded, hanging in strips. His face was a mask of stretched, pale skin, his eyes sunken and black. But it was his gait that was different. He didn't shamble, he stalked. A slow, deliberate movement, a predatory grace that sent a shiver down Eris's spine. This wasn't the same kind of infected they'd been fighting. The ones above ground, the early stages, were mindless, driven by a simple, insatiable hunger. This one had a terrifying focus. It moved with a purpose, its head tilted slightly, as if listening. New complication. Eris felt a cold dread bloom in his chest. They had been told the infected were slow, uncoordinated. This one had a terrifying focus. It moved with a purpose, its head tilted slightly, as if listening. New complication. Eris felt a cold dread bloom in his chest. They had been told the infected were slow, uncoordinated. This thing was neither. "Stay low, Hansen," Eris murmured, aiming. The metallic taste of fear was overwhelming now, hot and acrid in his mouth. He could feel the pulse hammering in his temples, hear the blood roaring in his ears. His palms were slick with sweat, making the grip of the carbine feel foreign, slick. The infected paused, its head twitching, as if it had caught a scent. It wasn't looking at them directly, but its gaze swept over their hiding place, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Then, with a low, guttural snarl that vibrated through the floor, it lunged. It wasn't a shambling run. It was a horrifying, animalistic sprint, faster than any human Eris had seen in days. It covered the distance in a blur, clearing the overturned stretcher with an unnatural leap. Eris squeezed the trigger. Crack, crack, crack. 3 rounds ripped through the stale air. The first hit it in the chest, tearing a ragged hole in the tattered lab coat. The second struck its shoulder, spinning it slightly. The third, aimed for the head, went wide, embedding itself in the concrete wall with a shower of dust. The creature roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and didn't falter. It absorbed the shots like they were mosquito bites, its momentum barely checked. This was no ordinary human nervous system they were dealing with. "Go for the head," Eris yelled, the words torn from his throat. He emptied the rest of his magazine, a controlled burst of fire, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding him in the dimness. The carbine bucked violently in his hands, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid, cutting through the decay. The spent casings flew, hot brass bouncing off his helmet. The infected stumbled, a round finally finding its mark, tearing away a chunk of its jaw. But it still kept coming, a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature. Its arm, long and skeletal, lashed out, swiping at Eris. He ducked, feeling the wind of its passage brush his ear. The blow connected with the concrete wall behind him, leaving a deep gouge, sending vibrations up his spine. Hansen opened fire, her shots less controlled, more frantic. The creature twisted, a round hitting it square in the temple. This time, it dropped. Its body spasmed, limbs thrashing, kicking up dust and debris. A low, wet gurgle escaped its ruined throat before it finally stilled, lying in an unnatural tangle. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Eris's chest heaved. He ripped off his respirator, gasping for air, the putrid smell hitting him with renewed force. His heart was a drum solo against his ribs. He felt the bile rise in his throat, the bitter taste of fear and adrenaline. He wanted to vomit, to collapse. His muscles screamed with fatigue, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely eject the spent magazine. "Holy, holy hell," Hansen whispered, staring at the fallen creature. That wasn't like the others, Dr. Thorne." "No, it wasn't," Eris agreed, ramming a fresh magazine home with a practiced click. He didn't have many more. "It's evolving, adapting. Or maybe it's been down here, incubating, longer than we thought." The thought was a chilling realization. If this was the next stage, then they were utterly doomed. He pushed off the wall, his legs unsteady. We need to move, now, before its friends show up. They moved through the corridors, Eris leading, Hansen covering his six. Every shadow was scrutinized. Every distant creak of the groaning facility became a potential threat. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the air growing heavy with a metallic dampness. Pipes overhead dripped, the sound amplified in the silence, each drop like a hammer blow against the tension. They passed through what used to be the primary data center. Servers lay shattered, sparking wires hissing faintly, casting an eerie strobe-like light. Half-eaten MREs were scattered across desks, computers still displaying fragmented code, a silent testament to the rapid collapse. Here, the bodies were different, not ripped apart, but slumped, as if they'd simply died at their posts. Eris wondered if the virus had another trick up its sleeve, a more insidious form of death before the reanimation. Suddenly, Eris froze. He held up a hand, stopping Hansen. "What is it?" she whispered, her carbine already raised. Eris strained his ears. A faint sound, almost imperceptible over the din of his own frantic heart. A rhythmic thumping. Not the shuffling gait of the basic infected. Not the heavy, deliberate steps of the stalker they'd just faced. This was faster, lighter, and there were many of them. He edged closer to a junction, peering through a cracked window in a fire door. Beyond it was a wider service tunnel, usually a bustling thoroughfare for maintenance crews. Now it was a funnel for horrors. Through the dim, flickering light, he saw them. Dozens. Not walking, not stalking. They were running. Their forms were emaciated, almost skeletal, their clothes tattered strips clinging to stick-thin limbs. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on broken strings. But they were fast, unnaturally fast. They scrabbled over the debris, their bare feet slapping wetly against the concrete. Their heads lolled, their jaws unhinged, letting out a constant chittering snarl. Their eyes, even in the dimness, seemed to glow with a malevolent, frantic energy. The runners. The CDC's worst-case scenario. A theoretical mutation that accelerated the necrotic decay while maintaining the host's musculature, making them terrifyingly swift. A biological nightmare Eris had helped model, never truly believing it would become reality. They poured into the service tunnel from a collapsed section at the far end, a tide of hungry, unstoppable death. Their chittering snarls grew louder, a chorus of pure, unadulterated primal hunger that vibrated through the very structure of the building. The air grew heavy, not just with decay, but with the ozone tang of impending violence. "Runners," Eris breathed, the word a death sentence. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an extinction event. His escape route, if it even existed, was now blocked by a sprinting horde. Hansen let out a small, choked gasp beside him, her face paling further, eyes wide with horror as she processed the sheer speed and numbers. The cold, logical part of Eris's brain clicked into overdrive, calculating probabilities. 0. The odds of making it through that tunnel were 0. He looked around frantically. A maintenance shaft, bolted shut, high on the wall. A narrow vent, too small for a human. A solid steel door, surely locked, leading to where? They were trapped, boxed in. The nearest runner spotted them, its head snapping up, a guttural shriek tearing from its ruined throat. It pointed a skeletal finger, its broken nail almost touching the glass of the fire door, its single, burning eye fixed on them. It started to pound on the door, its bony fists striking the steel with surprising force, the metal groaning under the repeated impacts. Its chittering snarls intensified, a frenzied hunger rising in its broken voice. The other runners, alerted by its cry, turned, dozens of vacant, burning eyes now fixed on their position. The thumping of their feet grew into a terrifying crescendo, shaking the very foundations. The air filled with their frenzied, guttural roars, a symphony of oncoming death. Eris gripped his M4, his knuckles white. He had maybe 6 rounds left in his current magazine, another 2 magazines in his rig. Hansen probably had a little more, not nearly enough. He could feel the vibration of the door being battered, the faint metallic groan of the hinges under the relentless assault. It wouldn't hold for long. The taste of fear in his mouth was no longer just metallic. It was bitter, nauseating, like spoiled meat. He could smell their putrid breath, even through the door, a faint, sickly sweet odor that somehow spoke of desperation and decay. The sheer hopelessness of the situation washed over him, a cold, crushing wave. There was nowhere left to go. The horde was at their heels, a new, faster, more terrifying wave of death. And the door, their last flimsy barrier, was starting to buckle. He could hear the first faint creak of protesting metal, a sound that spoke of imminent failure. "Eris, what do we do?" Hansen's voice was a barely audible whisper, thick with despair. She was shaking, openly now. Eris looked at her, then back at the groaning door, then at the frantic, hungry faces pressed against the cracked window, their eyes burning with an unholy light. He didn't have an answer. Only the chilling certainty that this was it. The last stand. And the first wave of a horror they were completely unprepared for was about to break through. The door didn't just buckle, it screamed. A sickening, metallic shriek tore through the oppressive silence of their desperate wait, followed by the sickening crack of splintering wood and groaning, stressed steel. It wasn't a clean break, but a violent, tearing wound in the already fragile barrier. Eris felt the vibration travel through the worn concrete floor, up into his boots, and settle as a chilling tremor in his gut. The stench of their pursuers, previously a faint, putrid whisper, now surged through the jagged gap, a concentrated wave of decay and something sharper, fouler, like rancid blood and sour bile. It burned the inside of his nostrils, making his eyes water instinctively. "They're coming!" Hansen's voice was a raw, strained gasp, barely audible over the renewed, guttural chorus that erupted from beyond the fractured doorway. She raised her rifle, her hands trembling, but her jaw was set. A flicker of primal fury momentarily eclipsed the fear in her eyes. The first infected was a horrifying blur of speed and unnatural strength. It didn't push or claw its way through. It launched itself, a missile of putrid flesh and unholy hunger. The doorframe, already weakened, gave way with a final protesting groan as the creature slammed through, propelled by a force that seemed impossible for its emaciated frame. Its face, once human, was a mask of grotesque rage. Eyes milky white, capillaries burst like spiderwebs across the sclera. Mouth stretched unnaturally wide to reveal rows of jagged, elongated teeth. A thick, greenish fluid bubbled at the corners of its lips. Eris didn't hesitate. Instinct, honed by weeks of nightmare survival, took over. His M4 barked, a deafening crack in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash was a blinding orange blossom, momentarily searing his vision. The first round slammed into the creature's chest with a wet thwack, tearing through what little flesh remained. A sickening spray of dark, viscous blood erupted, splattering the concrete floor, and, he grimaced, a fine mist of it kissed his cheek. He felt a phantom warmth, immediately chilled by revulsion. The recoil bucked against his shoulder, a familiar bruising punch. He double-tapped, a rapid crack-crack. The second shot hit the creature's shoulder, spinning it slightly, but it still lunged, its roars now a choked gurgle. The third round, aimed for the head, found its mark. The creature's skull exploded in a sickening display of bone fragments and gray matter, like a ripe melon dropped from a great height. It hit the ground with a wet, heavy thud, twitching violently for a few agonizing seconds before falling still, a rapidly cooling mound of horror. The smell of fresh gore, sharp and coppery, layered over the existing stench of decay, was almost overwhelming. But it was just the first. Behind it, a terrifying wave pressed forward, eyes burning, arms flailing, a cacophony of snarls and hungry screams. The opening was narrow, but they were using each other, clambering over their fallen comrade, a writhing mass of desperation and death. Hansen opened fire then, her rifle chattering in a short, controlled burst. Brrrt! 3 rounds slammed into the chest of the next infected, trying to squeeze through. It stumbled, a ragged hole blooming on its sternum, but kept coming, fueled by an unnatural, manic energy. Its momentum carried it forward, its clawed hands reaching, grasping for air, for them. Hansen adjusted her aim, her breath catching in her throat, and delivered a precise headshot. Crack! The creature's head snapped back, a sickening crunch of bone, and it crumpled. "Keep firing!" Eris yelled, his voice hoarse, a thin tremor running through it. He emptied the rest of his current magazine in a series of rapid, aimed shots. Crack, 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 crack. Each round was precious, a sliver of hope against an ocean of despair. He targeted the chest and shoulders, trying to disrupt their charge, to buy precious seconds. The infected were shockingly resilient. Some seemed to absorb rounds that would fell a normal human, only slowing marginally before pushing on, driven by an insatiable hunger. Their blood was thicker, darker, and when it splattered, it felt greasy like motor oil on his skin. He slammed home a fresh magazine, the familiar solid clack, a small comfort in the chaos. The weight of the fresh rounds in the magazine, though limited, felt like a momentary reprieve. His fingers, slick with sweat and something else, worked automatically, smoothly. He heard Hansen struggling with her own reload, a frantic fumbling that spoke volumes about her fear. The doorframe, now a mangled maw of splintered wood and twisted metal, was a funnel for their doom. Another 2 infected were pushing through, their bodies intertwined in their eagerness, their roars echoing off the concrete walls, making his teeth ache. One of them, its lower jaw hanging loose, drooling stringy saliva, caught a glimpse of Eris. Its eyes, burning with malevolent focus, locked onto him. It let out a shriek that was less human, more animalistic, a sound that scraped against his eardrums like fingernails on a chalkboard. He fired, leading with the M4. A round clipped the first creature's shoulder, tearing a ragged flap of skin and muscle, but it barely registered. It kept its trajectory, pushing its companion forward. Eris grimaced, adjusting his aim slightly, and put 2 rounds center mass into the second creature, the one with the hanging jaw. Its chest cavity seemed to expand with the impact, a grotesque blossoming, and then it convulsed, momentarily blocking the path of the first. This gave him a split second. Crack! Headshot. The first creature finally dropped, its momentum carrying it into the pile of its fallen brethren. The pile was growing, a gruesome barricade of twitching, lifeless forms. But it wasn't deterring the others. It was just a hurdle. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The smell was a multi-layered assault, the coppery tang of fresh blood, the pungent metallic scent of burnt gunpowder, the cloying sweetness of decay, and the acrid tang of his own fear sweat mixing with Hansen's. He could taste it, a bitter metallic tang coating his tongue, like licking an old coin. His heart was a frantic drum solo against his ribs, threatening to burst through. His lungs burned with every ragged breath he pulled in. Hansen let out a cry, a choked sob, as another infected, faster, more agile, managed to slip past the immediate pile. It was smaller, its frame wiry, almost skeletal, but it moved with a terrifying, unnatural grace. Its eyes, sunk deep in its skull, gleamed with intelligent malevolence. It wasn't just blindly charging, it was aiming for the gap, for the opportunity. "Eris!" Hansen screamed, her voice cracking. She had fired, but missed, the bullet sparking off the concrete wall near the creature. Her hands were shaking so violently that her aim was off. Eris pivoted, adrenaline screaming through his veins. The small infected was low to the ground, scuttling like an enormous starved insect. He dropped his rifle, pulling his sidearm, a Beretta M9, in one fluid motion. His hand was a blur. Pop, pop. The 9mm rounds lacked the stopping power of the M4, but they were quicker to deploy in such a close-quarters dynamic situation. The first shot struck the creature in the leg, not stopping it, but making it stumble. The second, aimed higher, caught it in the chest. It let out a high-pitched, almost human shriek of pain and rage, but it didn't fall. It surged forward, teeth bared, its arms outstretched, long yellow nails like talons. Eris didn't have time for another aimed shot. He swung the M9 like a club, slamming the heavy frame into the side of the creature's head with a sickening crunch. It staggered, disoriented, its shriek turning into a guttural moan. This was his chance. He put the barrel against its temple and squeezed the trigger. Pop! The creature's head snapped to the side, a geyser of dark blood and brain matter erupting from the exit wound. It dropped like a stone, twitching violently at his feet. The stench of its internal fluids was putrid, a concentrated burst of decay and sickness that made his stomach churn. He fought down the urge to vomit. He snapped his head up, scanning the door. The initial wave, maybe 10 or 12 strong, had been dealt with, leaving a grisly, tangled mound of bodies. But behind them, the mass was still there, pressing forward, their roars relentless. The doorframe was now a gaping maw, splintered wood hanging like broken teeth. The structural integrity was completely compromised. "We can't hold this forever, Eris," Hansen gasped, tears streaming down her grime-streaked face, mixing with the sweat. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dim, flickering emergency lights. Her voice was thin, reedy, on the verge of breaking. He knew. The M4 was almost empty. His sidearm had maybe 3 rounds left. Hansen had a little more, but not much. He could feel the desperate, gnawing hunger in his own stomach, the exhaustion in his bones, but adrenaline was a potent temporary drug. As he re-shouldered his M4, his eyes darted around the small, grimy room. No other exits, just the one hallway behind them leading to nowhere. The CDC Containment facility was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress. It felt like a sieve. Then he heard it. Not from the front, where the infected continued their relentless, maddening chorus of snarls and thumps against the barricade of their dead. This sound was different. It was a low, resonant groan, a deep structural complaint that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the building. It came from above. Not a single sharp noise, but a protracted, drawn-out grinding, like immense, ancient gears slowly turning, or stressed metal tearing under immense, unforgiving weight. It was overlaid with the distinct, unsettling sound of shifting debris. Dust, fine and gritty, began to rain down from the ceiling, clinging to the grimy surfaces, settling on their hair and clothes. Hansen heard it too. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, pupils dilated with a fresh wave of terror. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The sound was too deep, too heavy to be another infected. The building itself was screaming. Eris looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stained, reinforced concrete ceiling. A thin, hairline crack, barely visible before, now seemed to be widening, a dark, jagged vein appearing across the expanse. And from somewhere further back, deeper within the facility, a series of muffled, concussive thumps resonated, rhythmic and heavy, like something impossibly large was being dropped or moving, relentlessly, through the infrastructure above them. Each thud sent a shiver down his spine, a primal warning. This wasn't just the horde at the door. This was the facility itself, crumbling around them. A new, terrifying complication. The days of panic were far from over. They were trapped, not just by the horrors outside, but by the decaying behemoth of the CDC building, slowly collapsing, perhaps even revealing a pathway for something else to join the fray. The walls felt like they were closing in, the very air growing heavier, laden with the dust of destruction and the metallic tang of fear. The battle at the door was desperate, but the unseen threat from above, the slow, agonizing death of their last refuge, was far more terrifying. Eris gripped his M4 tighter, his knuckles bone white, the familiar weight of the weapon a meager comfort against the overwhelming two-pronged assault. There was no escape, only an increasingly violent, desperate, and ultimately hopeless last stand. A fine grit, like pulverized bone and ancient concrete, began to sift down from the ceiling, catching in the harsh glare of the emergency lights. It dusted his hair, his shoulders, clung to the slick sweat on his forehead. The air grew thick, abrasive, filling his nostrils with the acrid scent of ozone mixed with decaying matter and the faint coppery tang of drying blood that coated the blast door. The cacophony intensified. Outside, the gnashing teeth and guttural roars of the infected swelled into a monstrous chorus, punctuated by the metallic shriek of steel bending under impossible pressure. Inside, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump from above became louder, more resonant, vibrating through the very floor beneath his worn boots. Each impact felt less like something dropping and more like something walking, something with immense, crushing weight. "The ceiling!" someone screamed, a voice raw with terror. Eris didn't need to look. A section of the concrete near the far wall, where a massive conduit snaked upwards, sagged with a sickening groan. A shower of plaster and rebar dust exploded downwards, momentarily blinding a technician who had been trying to rig a makeshift barricade with filing cabinets. The man cried out, stumbling back, clutching his eyes. The M4 felt like a toy in Eris's hands, utterly insufficient against the forces gathering to crush them. "Keep firing," Sergeant Eva Rostova's voice, hoarse but steady, cut through the din. "Don't let them breach." The blast door, a solid inch of reinforced steel, was buckling inwards. The sound of tearing metal was horrific, a slow-motion unraveling of their last defense. Already, a crack had appeared near the top, weeping thin tendrils of rusty dust. Through it, a glimpse of diseased, pallid flesh, an eye socket devoid of an actual eyeball, and the endless gnashing of teeth. The stench, now magnified, was overwhelming, a cloying, putrid sweetness of rot and sickness, like a butcher shop left to fester in the summer sun for a month, overlaid with the sharp, metallic tang of fresh, terrified sweat. Eris could almost taste it, a bitter, chemical dryness at the back of his throat that no amount of gulping could alleviate. His M4 barked, a controlled burst of 3 rounds. The recoil was a familiar jolt against his shoulder, a solid thrum that sent vibrations up his arm. The rounds tore through the crack, spitting shards of twisted steel and what looked like a splintered jawbone back into the horde. A wet, bubbling scream was immediately swallowed by the ravenous multitude. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning, adrenaline pumping a cold, icy rush through his veins, sharpening every sense to a painful degree. He could feel the grit on his teeth, the sweat running down his back, the desperate, ragged breaths of his comrades beside him. Across from him, Private Miller, a fresh-faced recruit barely out of basic, was shaking, his own rifle a trembling extension of his fear. His eyes were wide, darting between the groaning door and the collapsing ceiling. "They're gonna come through, Eris," he whispered, his voice thin, reeking of fresh terror. "They're gonna come from everywhere." Eris didn't reply. He couldn't. The truth of Miller's words was a cold blade in his gut. He slammed a fresh magazine into his M4 with a practiced click, the motion automatic, muscle memory overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze him. The cool metal of the magazine against his palm was one of the few tangible comforts in this spiraling nightmare. Suddenly, a section of the ceiling directly above them heaved. Not just sagged, but lifted, then dropped again with a catastrophic roar. A chunk of concrete, the size of a small car, tore free and plummeted, smashing into the floor just meters away from Eris. The impact sent a shock wave through the ground, vibrating up his legs, rattling his teeth. Dust exploded upwards in a choking cloud, momentarily obscuring everything. The emergency lights flickered violently, then held, casting grotesque, shifting shadows. Through the settling dust, a new sound began to filter down from the gaping maw in the ceiling. A wet, rasping inhale, impossibly deep, followed by a guttural rumble that vibrated in Eris's chest. A sound so profound it felt like his internal organs were vibrating. It was not the high-pitched, frenzied snarl of the infected. This was different, older, heavier, more conscious. What in God's name was that? Miller choked, his face ash-pale. Sergeant Rostova, ever the professional, barked orders, her voice strained but firm. Keep your eyes on the door. Don't look up unless you want to eat a ceiling tile. But even she spared a terrified glance upwards, her face grim. The door groaned again, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of steel. A wider gap appeared, and through it, Eris saw not just the distorted faces, but hands. Too many hands. Claws, really, tipped with jagged, blackened nails, scrabbling and tearing. One clawed hand, impossibly long and gangly, managed to slip through the gap and began to pry at the edge of the door, ripping the thick insulation and soundproofing with sickening ease. The fingers were swollen, jointed at unnatural angles, and covered in pustules that oozed a viscous green-black fluid. The smell of that fluid was instantly recognizable, a concentrated version of the infection's putrid stench, but with a sharper, more chemical bite, like battery acid mixed with decay. "Focus fire on the breach point," Rostova commanded, swinging her own M4 to spray a concentrated burst into the opening. Rounds spat fire and lead, tearing through the writhing limbs. A sickening squelch indicated a successful hit, and the hand recoiled, leaving behind a streak of vile fluid on the door. Eris joined her, his rifle snapping upwards, spitting a controlled torrent of bullets. He could hear the impacts, wet and meaty, even over the din. He focused on the shapes he could discern, a distorted head, a shoulder, an arm. He wasn't aiming for kill shots anymore. He was aiming to disrupt, to injure, to buy precious seconds. The muzzle flash seared across his vision, leaving temporary dark spots. The heat radiating from the barrel was intense, scorching the air around his hands. But as they fought the immediate threat at the door, the threat from above grew exponentially. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump escalated into a continuous, grinding pressure. Dust and debris rained down incessantly, mixing with the sweat and the occasional spray of blood from the door, turning the floor into a treacherous, grimy slick. The air grew thick with the dust, catching in his throat, making every breath a shallow, rasping effort. And then, through the large hole in the ceiling, a new sound emerged. A dragging, scraping sound, like immense claws on concrete, followed by another deep, resonant inhale. This time, the inhale was accompanied by a slow, deliberate click, a sound too intricate, too mechanical to be natural. Eris's blood ran cold. From the gaping hole above, a shadow began to fall. Not a loose piece of concrete, but a moving, organic shadow. It was massive, black, and multi-jointed. As it slowly descended, silhouetted against the emergency lights from a higher level, Eris saw it. A leg. Not an infected leg, not a human leg, but something alien and terrifying. It was segmented like an insect's, but covered in a thick, chitinous plating that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Each segment was ridged, bristling with what looked like hardened spines. At the end of the limb, a massive three-pronged claw, easily the size of a man's torso, began to slowly lower itself into their space. A collective gasp went through the remaining defenders. Miller let out a whimper, his M4 clattering to the ground as he stared upwards, transfixed by the horror. "Miller, get your head in the game," Rostova roared, but it was too late. The massive claw slowly, deliberately scraped against the concrete wall, sending a fresh shower of sparks and dust down. The sound was like 1,000 nails on a blackboard, amplified 100-fold, grating against their very souls. The claw descended further, its weight undeniable. It wasn't moving with frantic, infected-like aggression, but with a ponderous, inexorable gravity. It felt like a geological event, not a creature. As it dipped lower, Eris could see more details. Faint, pulsing veins beneath the dark chitin. A faint, sickly green luminescence emanating from deep within its segmented joints. It smelled different. Not the cloying rot of the infected, but a sharp, metallic tang, like rusted iron and ozone, mixed with something deep, earthy, and primal, like ancient soil disturbed from a tomb.
The three-pronged claw ended in razor-sharp points, each one capable of tearing through steel. It was actively probing, feeling its way into the space, as if the creature was exploring its new access point. It's not one of them," Eris breathed, the words barely a whisper, a cold dread seizing his heart. This wasn't just a bigger infected. This was something else entirely, something grown, or created, or awakened. A new, far more intelligent and destructive horror. Suddenly, the blast door shrieked one last time, a tortured cry of metal, and then gave way at the top. A flood of infected, a writhing mass of contorted limbs and gnashing teeth began to pour through the new wider gap. They were like a waterfall of putrid flesh, eyes burning with insatiable hunger. The stench of decay and fear became so potent, Eris felt his stomach churn, the taste of bile rising in his throat. Fall back to the next corridor," Rostova screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Covering fire, now!" The order was a jolt, breaking Eris from his horrified trance. He spun, his M4 spitting fire into the torrent of flesh. He saw faces, or what used to be faces, contorted in agony and rage, their eyes milky white or bloodshot red. He saw hands, grasping, tearing, pulling at each other in their rabid hunger to reach fresh meat. He squeezed the trigger, letting the weapon cycle through bursts, the recoil a sharp, painful punctuation to the rising panic. Each bullet tore through flesh and bone, creating momentary gaps in the tide, but they were instantly filled by the ceaseless press behind. The ground beneath his feet was already littered with spent casings, creating a crunchy carpet that shifted with every step. He saw Miller, still staring, paralyzed at the monstrous claw descending from above. "Miller, move!" Eris roared, reaching out to grab the recruit's arm. But it was too late. The enormous three-pronged claw from above, moving with agonizing slowness, completed its descent. It settled, not on the floor, but on the concrete wall directly behind Miller. With a sickening crunch, the wall buckled inwards, crumbling like ancient paper. The claw then pulled. It wasn't a smash, it was a deliberate, controlled tear. A section of the wall, complete with exposed rebar and wiring, ripped away from the main structure, creating a massive, jagged new opening. Through this new aperture, Eris caught a glimpse of something truly colossal, hulking in the dimly lit upper levels. A vast, dark mass, barely discernible, but radiating an oppressive aura of immense power and malevolence. And for a fleeting second, he saw it. A single, enormous, multifaceted eye, glowing with an eerie phosphorescent green, fixing its gaze directly upon them. It was unlike any eye he had ever seen, more insectoid than reptilian, yet with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone. This creature was not mindlessly infected, it was observing. Miller finally screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as the wall beside him gave way. But before he could even turn to flee, a new horror unfolded. From the newly created breach, not another claw, but a torrent of smaller, chittering things began to pour out. They were like overgrown, mutated spiders, their bodies covered in the same dark chitin as the massive claw, their multiple legs scrambling with terrifying speed. Dozens, then hundreds swarmed down the wall, their tiny, razor-sharp mandibles clicking audibly, their pinprick eyes glinting with predatory hunger. They were a secondary wave, a living carpet of nightmares, pouring directly from the body of the larger entity, or perhaps merely nested within the upper levels it had just breached. The floor, still slick with blood and dust, became a blur of frantic, scurrying movement. "Spiders! Swarmers!" someone screamed, the voice choked with panic. The battle had just escalated from desperate to utterly hopeless. They were being attacked from two fronts now, the relentless horde at the blast door, and a new, faster, more insidious threat from the ceiling, unleashed by the colossal entity slowly tearing apart the building from above. Eris watched in horror as the first wave of chittering swarmers reached the ground, moving with blurring speed towards the nearest human target. One of them, no bigger than a man's hand, but bristling with venomous-looking spines, scuttled over a fallen piece of concrete and latched onto Miller's ankle. The recruit screamed again, a raw animal sound of agony as the creature's mandibles presumably sank in. He stumbled, collapsing backwards, his rifle still abandoned on the floor. More swarmers instantly converged on him, a black, living tide engulfing his legs, then his torso, then his face. His screams became muffled, then guttural, then ceased entirely, replaced by the sickening sound of chitin scraping against flesh and the wet, tearing sounds of a body being consumed. Eris fired, his M4 barking in furious defiance, tearing through the swarmers devouring Miller. The creatures exploded in a spray of black ichor and chitinous fragments, but for every one he killed, 10 more seemed to appear. He could feel them, a phantom sensation of countless legs crawling over his own skin, the taste of their metallic, earthy scent filling his mouth, making him gag. Sergeant Ristova, her face a mask of grim determination, was already laying down suppressing fire, her shouts of fall back now imbued with an undeniable urgency.
The retreat was disorderly, bordering on a rout. Soldiers scrambled, tripping over debris, their faces pale with terror. The sheer number of threats, the utter hopelessness of their situation, was breaking their resolve. The very air vibrated with the heavy, grinding movements of the colossal creature above, and the frenetic, chittering menace of its progeny below. Eris stumbled backwards, covering the retreat, his rifle spitting fire until the magazine clicked empty. He instinctively slapped the release, reloading with frantic speed, his fingers fumbling slightly in the haze of fear and exhaustion. The scent of ozone and cordite was thick, almost suffocating, now mixed with the pungent, alien musk of the swarmers and the omnipresent, sickly sweet odor of decay. He could hear the frantic cries of the retreating CDC personnel, their civilian clothes stark against the tactical gear of the soldiers, their terror palpable. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching despair. This was it, the last stand, and it was being fought against a growing tide of nightmares in a crumbling fortress that was becoming their tomb. The emergency lights flickered again, plunging them into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life, revealing a scene of absolute chaos and annihilation. The vast, multifaceted eye from above seemed to glow brighter in the gloom, an intelligent, ancient predator watching its trapped prey. The days of panic were indeed far from over. They had merely entered a new, more terrifying phase. The metallic clack of the fresh magazine seating home was a tiny, insignificant punctuation mark in the symphony of their impending doom. Yet Eris clung to its finality, its promise of continued resistance, no matter how futile. The rifle felt heavier now, warm and slick with his own sweat, a cruel extension of his own trembling hand.
He could taste the coppery tang of fear, sharp and acrid on his tongue, mingling with the metallic burn of adrenaline that had long since stopped being a boost and was now just an irritating tremor beneath his skin. His breath hitched, a raw rasp in his throat, each inhale filling his lungs with a cocktail of ozone, spent cordite, and the cloying, sickly sweet decay that was becoming the signature scent of the apocalypse. Above them, the colossal thing shifted, a monstrous, grinding groan that vibrated through the very soles of Eris's boots, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, rattling his teeth and churning his gut. Dust, fine as flour, sifted down from the scarred ceiling, mingling with larger chunks of plaster and concrete that peppered their retreat like malevolent rain. The emergency lights, never truly steady, now pulsed erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted the fleeing figures into grotesque caricatures of terror. One moment, blinding white, the next an abyss, then back again, revealing faces contorted by panic, eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on nothing but escape. "Go! Move!" Eris roared, his voice hoarse, raw, barely audible over the cacophony. He didn't know if he was addressing the remaining soldiers or the terrified cluster of CDC personnel, their lab coats and sensible shoes a stark, pathetic contrast to the crumbling, gore-splattered battleground. He saw Dr. Albright, her face ash gray, clutching a data tablet to her chest as if it were a shield, stumbling, nearly falling, only to be caught by a grim-faced soldier whose own gaze was distant, haunted. They moved like automatons, a herd driven by an unseen whip, each step a desperate lunge forward into the unknown, away from the certain horror behind. The swarmers, a chittering, scuttling carpet of living nightmare, were pressing their advantage. Their insectoid bodies, hard and chitinous, scraped and clicked against the floor, a sound that grated on Eris's raw nerves like sandpaper on bone. The stench they emitted, a pungent alien musk, burned in his nostrils, a promise of their imminent, tearing attacks. He fired, a controlled burst, the rifle bucking against his shoulder with a familiar, violent kick. 3 of the creatures at the forefront disintegrated in a spray of acidic green ichor and shattered carapace. The sound of their destruction was a wet splat, a sickening crunch that was immediately swallowed by the oncoming tide. More replaced them, flowing over the mangled remains of their brethren, driven by an inexorable, mindless hunger. Eris pivoted, laying down suppressing fire, forcing the creatures to momentarily hesitate, their multifaceted eyes glinting malevolently in the flickering light. He could hear the ragged breaths of the retreating group, the desperate grunts of the soldiers, the stifled sobs of the civilians. He could feel the desperate, hopeless energy draining from them, a palpable surrender seeping into the very air. They were losing ground, not just physically, but spiritually. The resolve was shattered, the fight was gone. All that remained was a desperate, animalistic urge to flee. Suddenly, a new sound ripped through the chaos, not the grinding of the colossal creature above, nor the chittering of its progeny below, but something else entirely. A high-frequency whine, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, vibrating in Eris's skull, making his teeth ache and his eyeballs throb. It built, a rapidly escalating shriek, growing in intensity until it felt like his brain was being squeezed in a vice. He clapped his hands over his ears reflexively, dropping his rifle for a terrifying second, his vision blurring. He heard a guttural scream from somewhere ahead, then another, cut short. The ceiling directly above them, a section of reinforced concrete and steel girders that had seemed structurally sound moments before, began to groan with a terrifying, amplified version of the creature's earlier movements. The whine intensified to an unbearable pitch, and then, with a sound like 1,000 car crashes compressed into a single terrifying moment, the entire section gave way. Not a collapse from below, but a precise, devastating demolition from above. It wasn't just falling debris, it was an act of surgical, malevolent destruction. A massive, jagged shard of what looked like the creature's chitinous hide, dark, glistening, and impossibly sharp, tore through the concrete and twisted metal like paper, plunging down, driven by an unseen force. It was like a monstrous spear hurled from the heavens. The impact was deafening, a visceral crump that threw Eris forward, sending a blinding cloud of concrete dust and pulverized insulation erupting into the already suffocating air. The world dissolved into a chaos of screams, crumbling concrete, and the sickening grind of metal tearing. Eris hit the floor hard, the rifle clattering from his grasp, the wind knocked out of him. He lay gasping, tasting blood and grit, the high-pitched ringing in his ears overriding all other sound. Darkness enveloped him as the emergency lights, finally giving up the ghost, died completely in this section of the corridor. Only the faint, sickly luminescence from the colossal eye, now partially obscured by the new debris, offered any light, casting monstrous, flickering shadows. When his vision cleared, stinging with dust and tears, he was in a new hell. A wall of twisted rebar, shattered concrete, and mangled ventilation ducts now blocked their retreat. The monstrous dark shard of chitin, thick as a tree trunk, had punched clean through the floor and ceiling, bisecting the corridor. It was as if a giant predatory claw had simply reached down and ripped their escape path in half. "No, no," he heard someone wail, a desperate, broken sound. He pushed himself up, his body aching from the impact, tasting the metallic tang of his own blood in his mouth. He squinted through the dust cloud, trying to make sense of the carnage. The retreat was utterly severed. On one side, presumably the main group was trapped, their desperate cries muffled by the new barrier. On his side, a small, isolated cluster remained. There were perhaps 5 other soldiers, dazed and disoriented, and 3 CDC personnel, including Dr. Albright, all choked with dust, their faces smeared with grime and shock. The air was thick, heavy, unbreathable, filled with the pungent smell of ruptured electrical conduits and raw concrete. And then, through the settling dust, Eris heard it. The familiar, sickening chittering. Louder now, much closer. The swarmers had not been deterred by the collapse, they had been herded. The mother creature, with its monstrous intellect, had not just destroyed their escape route, it had driven its progeny into a confined killing zone. From the gaps in the newly created debris wall, from the shattered ventilation shafts that now offered new entry points, they began to pour. A torrent of hard-shelled, multi-legged nightmares, their segmented bodies clicking and scuttling with frantic speed. "Ambush!" Eris screamed, finding his rifle, his fingers fumbling for the familiar grip. The butt felt alien, heavy, cold. He wiped his gritty eyes with the back of his hand, trying to clear his vision. The sheer volume of them was overwhelming. They didn't come in waves, they came in a solid, undulating mass. "Spread out, back to the wall," a soldier, Sergeant Miller, yelled, his voice strained, raw with fear but still authoritative. He was a stocky man, his face a map of old scars, now caked in gray dust. He lifted his own rifle, unleashing a volley of fire. Bang, bang, bang. Each shot echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space, followed by the wet splatter of destroyed creatures. Eris joined him, firing in short, controlled bursts. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, a jarring reminder of the violence he was enacting, the violence he was receiving. The taste of gun smoke, bitter and sharp, filled his mouth, mingling with the dust and the alien musk. He could see their multifaceted eyes, hundreds of them, reflecting the dim, sickly light, unblinking, utterly devoid of mercy. Their sharp, chitinous limbs tore at the air, snapping, eager to rend flesh. One of the swarmers, larger than the others, leaped with surprising agility, landing on the chest of a young soldier named Private Ramirez. Ramirez screamed, a gurgling, strangled sound, as the creature's mandibles tore into his Kevlar, then into the soft flesh beneath.
Eris pivoted, firing, the bullet tearing through the creature and, horrifyingly, through Ramirez's head as well. The soldier fell, a lifeless, twitching heap, his blood a dark, glistening stain on the gray concrete. The scent of fresh blood, warm and metallic, instantly drew more of the creatures, a feeding frenzy about to erupt. Fall back to the lab door," Eris yelled, his voice cracking. He gestured wildly towards a heavy, reinforced door a few yards behind them, slightly recessed into the wall. It was their only hope for even momentary respite. They fought their way backwards, each step a desperate scramble. The swarmers were relentlessly pushing, a tide of snapping mandibles and grasping claws. Eris felt a searing pain in his left calf. He yelled, stumbling, twisting, catching a glimpse of a serrated limb that had torn through his uniform. He ignored it, the pain a distant throb in the adrenaline haze. He fired again, emptied his magazine, slammed a fresh one home. The familiar rapid clack was a brief comfort. Miller was a wall of defiance, his heavy machine gun spitting fire, creating a momentary corridor of clear ground. But it was fleeting. The creatures flowed around the empty spaces, pressing, always pressing. Dr. Albright, wide-eyed and terrified, fumbled with a sidearm she'd been given, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. A smaller swarmer leaped at her face. Eris, reacting on instinct, swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with a sickening crunch, sending the creature skittering back, momentarily stunned. They reached the lab door, a heavy, air-sealed blast door. "Get it open, now!" Miller bellowed, his voice raw. One of the remaining soldiers, a tech specialist, began frantically keying in codes on the rusted keypad, his fingers trembling, blood smeared on his cheek from a grazing wound. The creatures were upon them. Eris felt their bodies slamming into him, a disgusting weight of chittering chitin. He kicked, punched, fired, the taste of fear and metal a constant companion. The smell of decay, the alien musk, was overwhelming, making his eyes water, his stomach churn. He could feel the scraping of claws against his uniform, the vibrating hum of their bodies. Suddenly, the air in the cramped space changed. A deeper, more resonant vibration started, not from above, but from within the newly collapsed section of the corridor. A low, guttural growl, far deeper and more terrifying than the chittering of the swarmers. It was the sound of something larger, something heavier. The swarmers for a split second hesitated. Their frenetic energy seemed to drop, their chittering softening into an almost reverent silence. Then, from the very heart of the rubble, a new shadow began to detach itself from the gloom. It wasn't one of the small swarmers. It was massive, easily twice the size of a man, its segmented body thicker, its limbs ending in wickedly curved scythes. Its head, lower to the ground than the swarmers, was a horrifying mask of hardened plates, with a mouth that split open to reveal multiple rows of razor-sharp obsidian teeth. It was one of the larger progeny, a hunter. And it was emerging from the rubble, its multifaceted eyes glowing with a cold, predatory intelligence. The new complication wasn't just a trap, it was a cage that had sprung shut around them, isolating them with an even more formidable beast. The air itself seemed to solidify with the weight of its presence, and Eris knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that their last stand was about to become infinitely, terrifyingly worse. The air itself solidified, thickening into a viscous dread that tasted like old dust and cold metal on Eris's tongue. His gaze, locked on to the emerging hunter, felt brittle, stretched taut as a wire about to snap. The thing was a monstrous inversion of nature, an affront to all that was right. Its multifaceted eyes, the color of bruised plums, tracked them with an unnerving, deliberate intelligence, not the frenzied chaos of the swarmers. Those obsidian scythes, gleaming wetly in the anemic beam of his helmet light, promised a clean, surgical kind of death, not the tearing frenzy of the smaller beasts.
A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the rock, not just from the creature, but from the very ground beneath Eris's boots. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting, of ancient earth groaning under an impossible weight. The smaller swarmers, a chittery tide of segmented horror, had receded slightly, forming a pulsating semicircle around the hunter. They were waiting, a macabre audience. The metallic scent of ozone and cordite, previously so sharp, was now overwhelmed by the hunter stench. A sickening cocktail of stagnant pond water, ammonia, and something else, something deeply organic and putrescent, like a slaughterhouse floor left to rot under a summer sun. It seeped into his lungs, burning, clinging to the back of his throat. "Contact!" Eris's voice was a ragged bark, raw with adrenaline. "Hunter, open fire! Aim for the head plates or joints!" The M4 in his hands felt impossibly heavy, its cold steel a familiar comfort against the tremors that threatened to shake his arms apart. Beside him, Elias grunted, his breath catching in a strangled gasp. Maya, her face a mask of pale determination, leveled her own weapon, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. Dr. Petrov, bless his stubborn soul, fumbled for a sidearm. His scientific curiosity momentarily overshadowed by pure, unadulterated fear. The hunter didn't charge, it moved. It wasn't a rush, but a glide, a terrifyingly fluid motion for something so massive. Each segmented leg articulated with an unnerving precision, its body swaying slightly, like a predator testing the wind. The ground vibrated with each heavy step, a sickening rhythm against the frantic drumming of Eris's heart. Its head, low and armored, swiveled, its eyes locking onto each of them in turn, a chilling appraisal that promised pain. It was studying them, assessing the threat. "Now!" Eris screamed, the word torn from his throat. The cacophony was instantaneous, deafening. The M4 ripped into life, the sharp crack, crack, crack of automatic fire echoing brutally in the confined space. Muzzle flashes blossomed, strobing violet and orange against the gloom, burning residual images onto Eris's retinas. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, a familiar, bruising punch, but this time it felt inadequate, puny. He aimed for the center mass, the thickest part of its armored carapace, then adjusted, trying to hit the joints where the scythes met its torso. Thwack, thwack, thud. The bullet struck with sickening force. But the hunter, instead of flinching, seemed to absorb them. A few ricocheted with sparks, whining off the hardened plates. Others simply disappeared, burrowing into the chitinous armor with a sound like stones hitting wet clay. No blood, no visible injury. "It's too thick," Elias roared, his voice strained, his own M4 spitting fire. "Heavy armor!" The swarmers, meanwhile, had begun to chitter again, their collective sound rising in pitch and intensity. They began to twitch, to shift, forming a denser, more agitated wall of movement behind their master. Their hunger, momentarily subdued by the hunter's presence, was returning, amplified by the perceived weakness of their prey. The hunter finally reacted, not with a roar, but a sickeningly precise strike. One of its massive scythe limbs blurred, a movement so impossibly fast for its bulk that Eris barely registered it. It wasn't aimed at them, not directly. Instead, it slammed into the already unstable rock wall to their left, precisely where the tunnel had begun to narrow. A sickening crunch reverberated through the very bones in Eris's skull. Dust exploded outwards, a choking cloud of pulverized concrete and grit. A shower of smaller rocks and debris rained down, stinging his exposed skin, blinding him for a split second. The wall itself groaned, a sound of tortured metal and stressed stone, as a new, larger crack spiderwebbed across its surface. "Collapse!" Maya yelled, her voice muffled by the sudden deluge of dust. Eris stumbled back, coughing, trying to blink away the grit that coated his eyelashes. His vision was momentarily obscured, a milky haze of pulverized rock. The acrid tang of the dust filled his nostrils, mixing with the hunter's stench and the sharp, burning scent of cordite. He could feel the fine powder grating between his teeth, taste its bitterness. Through the shimmering veil of dust, the hunter's glowing eyes were still fixed on them. It hadn't attacked them directly, but it had attacked their position. It was not just a beast, it was a tactician. It was trying to destabilize their cover, to narrow their already constricted escape route even further. Then came the sound. It wasn't a growl, nor a shriek. It was a resonant, vibrating frequency that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and go straight for his brain. A low, powerful hum that built, escalating in intensity until it became a physical force. It was like standing inside a colossal, malfunctioning subwoofer. His teeth rattled, his vision blurred, not from dust, but from the sheer vibratory force. The ground under his feet didn't just shake, it bucked. Pain lanced through his temples, a splitting agony that made him drop to one knee, clutching his head. He heard strangled cries from Elias and Maya, saw Petrov crumple to the ground, his hands clamped over his ears, his face screwed up in agony. The M4, still clutched in Aris's hands, felt like it was buzzing with an electric current. The tunnel ceiling, already weakened by the hunter's earlier strike, reacted violently to this new sonic assault. A deafening roar erupted from above as the structural integrity of the rock finally gave way. More sections of the ceiling, already fractured and bowing, tore free. Massive slabs of concrete, steel rebar twisting like taffy, crashed down with concussive force. "Get down!" Aris screamed, though his own voice sounded distorted, alien in his ears. He threw himself forward, dragging his body under the meager shelter of a remaining, twisted support beam, the dust still thick and stinging. He tasted blood. Had he bitten his tongue, or was it the coppery tang of fear, now overwhelming his mouth? He pressed his face into the grimy floor, the vibrations making his teeth ache, the roaring above a prelude to his own burial. The impact of the falling debris was immense. The air was sucked out of his lungs, replaced by a suffocating cloud of dust and the metallic reek of shattered concrete. The ground bucked and shook, a relentless tremor that threatened to dislocate his bones. He heard a sickening, wet thud that was too close, followed by a choked gasp. When the immediate deluge subsided, leaving behind a new landscape of rubble and exposed jagged rebar, Aris slowly pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. The ringing in his ears was deafening, a high-pitched whine that threatened to drive him mad. He spat out grit and a dark, coppery mouthful of blood. His eyes, still watering and burning, scanned the new, terrifying tableau. The tunnel was even narrower now. The debris from the ceiling collapse had piled up, creating new obstacles, new death traps. And in the midst of it, something worse. Elias. He lay sprawled, half buried under a slab of concrete, his M4 twisted beneath him. A thin, dark line of blood snaked from beneath his helmet, across his temple. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the newly exposed rock above. His body was still. Too still. Aris's gut clenched, a cold, sickening coil of despair. Elias was gone. Elias! Maya's voice was a sob, raw and broken, the name tearing from her. She was on her knees, cradling her own head, her face pale, streaked with dust and tears. Dr. Petrov was still slumped, groaning, slowly pushing himself up. Miraculously, he seemed uninjured, just disoriented and terrified. The hunter stood, utterly unfazed by its own destructive creation. It had merely shifted back a few paces, letting the debris fall where it may. Its multifaceted eyes glinted, a cruel satisfaction in their depths. It had narrowed the playing field, eliminated one of their numbers, and further trapped them. It was playing a deadly game of chess, and they were the pawns. But the sonic blast had done more than just bring down the ceiling.
As the dust began to settle, revealing the newly mangled landscape of the tunnel, Aris noticed it. From a fissure, not one of the old ones, but a fresh, jagged tear in the rock wall where the hunter had struck earlier, something else was emerging. It wasn't a swarmer, it wasn't another hunter. It was a glistening, serpentine form, thin and whip-like, that snaked out of the newly formed opening. It was translucent, almost gelatinous, pulsing with a faint inner luminescence, like trapped bioluminescence. It moved with unnatural speed, propelled by muscular contractions, its head a blunt, eyeless probe. More followed, a spaghetti-like tangle of these strange living tendrils, each about 2 inches thick and several feet long, snaking out into the air. They were feelers, exploratory organs, or something far worse. They began to writhe, extending, testing the air, their translucent bodies seemingly drawn to the residual heat and chemical signature of the living. A sickening, sweet, almost floral scent, utterly alien and intoxicating, wafted from them, clashing violently with the putrescence of the hunter. It was like the smell of a beautiful but deadly night-blooming flower, masking poison. The swarmers, previously a wall of twitching hunger, now reacted with an even more pronounced reverence, almost fear for these new additions. They pressed themselves back further into the rubble, their chittering dropping to a low, terrified murmur. The hunter itself, which had seemed so utterly dominant, now shifted its stance. Its scythe-like limbs twitched, and its head lowered slightly, as if in deference or perhaps communication. Its glowing eyes fixed not on Eris, but on the new, pulsating tendrils. The situation was no longer just dire, it was unfathomable. They were trapped between a massive, intelligent predator that had just murdered Elias, and these new, horrifying, bioluminescent tendrils emerging from a fresh tear in reality. The sweet, cloying scent of the tendrils made Eris's head spin, his stomach churn. Was it a pheromone, a paralytic agent? He looked at Meyer, her face twisted in grief and terror, then at Petrov, still dazed, but now staring with wide-eyed horror at the new threat. The taste of dust, blood, and fear was overpowering. Elias was gone, and their last stand had just transformed into an unwinnable gauntlet, a multi-front assault by horrors beyond their comprehension. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was the beginning of the end. And the end was just starting to show its true multifaceted face. Eris raised his M4, its barrel heavy, his resolve brittle but unbroken. He would not go down without a fight, not while Maya and Petrov still breathed. He would make them pay, whatever them truly was. He just hoped his trembling hands would obey. The acrid tang of gunpowder was a welcome distraction, momentarily cutting through the sickeningly sweet perfume of the tendrils that now pulsed and writhed before them. Elias's last breath still seemed to hang in the air, a phantom chill, a fresh wound in Eris's soul that bled alongside the gaping horror of the new threat. His M4 felt heavy, cold, a desperate anchor in a world tilting towards madness. The butt plate pressed hard against his shoulder, a familiar comfort, a promise of violence. Not yet, not today, not without a fight. The thought was a ragged mantra, thin and frayed, but still there. He could feel the fine dust coating his tongue, gritty and dry, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline that flooded his mouth. Maya, her face a mask of tear-streaked terror, had sunk further into the jagged debris. Her chest heaved, silent sobs racking her small frame. Petrov, still half-stunned from the fall, stared, mouth agape, at the undulating, phosphorescent horror that had just stolen their focus from the monstrous hunter. His eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the alien glow of the tendrils. The chittering creatures, pushed back into the deeper shadows, had fallen utterly silent, a chorus of terror replaced by a suffocating hush, punctuated only by the wet, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the tendrils as they pulsed, drawing something unseen from the rent in reality. The tendrils were moving now, slowly at first, like monstrous bioluminescent worms emerging from a wound. They stretched, slender and flexible, yet impossibly thick, easily 10 feet in length, their tips ending in something that wasn't quite a hand, not quite a mouth, but a complex, grasping, sphincter-like opening that pulsed with its own sickly internal light. The air grew thicker, heavier, saturated with that cloying sweetness. It wasn't just a smell anymore, it was a physical presence, coating the inside of Eris's nostrils, sticking to the back of his throat. His head began to throb, a dull ache blossoming behind his eyes, a dizzying nausea swirling in his gut. Pheromone? Toxin? He fought the urge to gag, forcing his breathing to remain shallow, trying to filter the air through gritted teeth. The hunter, a silent obsidian monolith of segmented dread, had indeed lowered its head. Its glowing crimson eyes, usually fixed with predatory intent, were now trained on the nascent tendrils, a flicker of something that might have been reverence or perhaps calculated assessment. It shifted its weight, its scythe-like limbs scraping against the ruined concrete with a dry, unsettling rasp. It wasn't attacking, it wasn't even threatening, it was waiting, observing, like a general watching his vanguard deploy. "Eris, what are those things?" Petrov's voice was a reedy whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic pulse. His body still trembled, a low hum of fear emanating from him. "Doesn't matter," Eris snarled, the words tasting like ash. He brought the M4 up, the front sight post settling on the thickest, most prominent tendril, its bioluminescence a perfect target against the shadowed backdrop. His finger tightened on the trigger. The weapon bucked against his shoulder, a familiar surge of controlled violence. Crack, 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 crack. 4 rounds ripped through the air, their supersonic snarl momentarily tearing through the oppressive silence. The impact was sickening. Not a clean tearing, not a spray of blood. The tendril convulsed, whipping back with unexpected speed, a thick, viscous ichor, clear but shimmering with the same internal light, oozing from the bullet holes. The sweet scent intensified, a burst of concentrated cloying horror. It wasn't a wound, not really, more like an inconvenience. The bullet holes began to slowly, horrifyingly, seal themselves, the pulsating tissue knitting itself back together with an unnatural speed. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the hunter, a sound of irritation, not pain. Its glowing eyes flickered towards Eris, a silent warning, a promise of retribution. Eris's blood ran cold. He had seen regenerating organisms, but nothing like this. This wasn't just fast healing, this was restoration. Like the very fabric of its being was a malleable, self-repairing entity. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the hunter, a sound of irritation, not pain. Its glowing eyes flickered towards Eris, a silent warning, a promise of retribution. Eris's blood ran cold. He had seen regenerating organisms, but nothing like this. This wasn't just fast healing, this was restoration. Like the very fabric of its being was a malleable, self-repairing entity.
He squeezed off another burst, aiming for the origin point, the shimmering tear itself. The bullet seemed to dissipate, absorbed by the rippling distortion in reality, leaving only faint, quickly vanishing rings on its surface. "Ineffective," he muttered, more to himself than his companions, his breath catching in his throat. The M4 felt suddenly inadequate, a toy gun against an eldritch god. "What do we do?" Maya's voice, though choked, held a spark of desperate resolve. She was pushing herself up, wiping tears and snot from her face with the back of a grimy hand. Her eyes, though red, were now fixed on the threat. Grief was still there, a heavy shroud, but the instinct for survival was flickering back to life. "We keep them off us," Eris replied, his voice rough. "Petrov, cover our 6. Watch for the chittering things. Don't let them flank us. Petrov nodded, his movements stiff, almost robotic. He raised his own weapon, an M16, but his hands trembled violently, the barrel waving in the air like a reed in a storm. He was still in shock, a fragile shell of a man, his fight-or-flight system overloaded. Eris could smell the faint, acrid tang of urine. Petrov had lost control. The realization was a bitter pill. He couldn't rely on him, not fully. The tendrils, disturbed by Eris's shots, began to move with purpose. They extended, slithering over the debris, their tips testing the air, their sphincter-like openings widening slightly, revealing intricate patterns of pulsating alien veins within. The sickening sweet smell intensified, now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched whirring sound, like an insect's wings magnified 1,000-fold. The sound was disorienting, designed to bore into the listener's skull, to unravel their concentration. One tendril, longer and thicker than the rest, shot forward with astonishing speed, faster than anything Eris had anticipated. It moved like a viper, its tip snaking through the air directly for Eris's head. He ducked instinctively, the viscous appendage whistling past his ear, the sudden gust of displaced air carrying an even more concentrated dose of its cloying scent. He felt a burning sensation on his cheek where it had just grazed him, a sticky residue left behind. He flinched, batting at it with his free hand, his fingers coming away coated in the shimmering, clear ichor. It stung like a mild acid, prickling his skin. "Don't let them touch you," he roared, the warning hoarse. He brought his M4 up again, firing a desperate burst into the retreating tendril. This time, he aimed for a point where it connected to the main mass, hoping to sever it. The bullets tore through, but again, the wound began to close. It was like shooting water. The damage was temporary, superficial. One tendril, longer and thicker than the rest, shot forward with astonishing speed, faster than anything Eris had anticipated. It moved like a viper, its tip snaking through the air directly for Eris's head. He ducked instinctively, the viscous appendage whistling past his ear, the sudden gust of displaced air carrying an even more concentrated dose of its cloying scent. He felt a burning sensation on his cheek where it had just grazed him, a sticky residue left behind. He flinched, batting at it with his free hand, his fingers coming away coated in the shimmering clear ichor. It stung, like a mild acid, prickling his skin. "Don't let them touch you," he roared, the warning hoarse. He brought his M4 up again, firing a desperate burst into the retreating tendril. This time, he aimed for a point where it connected to the main mass, hoping to sever it. The bullets tore through, but again, the wound began to close. It was like shooting water. The damage was temporary, superficial.
The hunter, meanwhile, had begun to move. It didn't charge them. Instead, it stalked towards the chittering creatures, which were still huddled in the shadows, paralyzed with fear. Its massive scythe limbs, each easily as long as Eris, scraped the ground with slow, deliberate movements. It reached one, a smaller, leaner mutant, and with a swift, brutal motion, impaled it clean through. There was no struggle, no scream, just a pathetic gurgle as the creature was lifted, twitching, into the air. The hunter then threw it, with surprising force, towards the group of tendrils. The tendrils, which had been focusing on Eris, suddenly redirected. They converged on the flung body, their sphincter-like tips unhinging, expanding, revealing a maw lined with rows of tiny, needle-sharp teeth that pulsed with inner light. They latched on to the chittering creature, tearing into it with shocking efficiency, the squelching sounds of rending flesh amplified by the cavernous space. The chittering creature's screams were cut short, absorbed by the gnashing horror. The tendrils pulsed brighter, the clear ichor now visibly tinged with a faint crimson. They were feeding, and the hunter was providing the meal. "It's hurting them!" Maya screamed, the realization dawning on her face. "It's feeding them useless things to get them closer." The reality was a hammer blow. The hunter wasn't an independent threat.
It was a glorified ranch hand, guiding its grotesque livestock. And they were the next course. "Maya, get to cover! Petrov, use suppressing fire! Keep them away!" Aris yelled, his voice cracking. He emptied another magazine into the approaching tendrils. The M4's recoil hammered his shoulder, each shot sending a wave of vibration through his arms, up to his teeth. The smell of hot metal and spent propellant filled his nose, cutting through the sickening sweet perfume, providing a moment's clarity. The tendrils, having consumed their appetizer, turned their full attention back to Eris's group. More of them were emerging from the tear, forming a pulsating, writhing curtain of light and horror. Their high-pitched whirring intensified, becoming a piercing drone that vibrated in Eris's bones, blurring his vision at the edges. The ground beneath his feet seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. A tendril lashed out, coiling around a piece of rebar sticking out from the rubble, bending the thick metal rod like putty. Another slammed into the concrete near Eris's feet, sending shards of stone flying, one of which sliced his forearm. He barely registered the pain, just the hot, wet smear of blood that immediately mixed with the dust and tendril ichor. Petrov, spurred by Maya's scream, or perhaps the sheer immediacy of the horror, finally opened fire.
His M16 rattled, a sporadic, uncontrolled burst. He was firing wildly, not aiming, but the sheer volume of noise was a temporary deterrent. The tendrils recoiled slightly from the hail of bullets, momentarily confused by the sudden aggression. But they didn't stop. They kept coming, a slow, inexorable tide of alien flesh. Eris dropped his empty magazine, the cold metal clattering against the concrete, and fumbled for a fresh one from his vest. His fingers, slick with sweat and the stinging itcher, slipped on the smooth plastic. Damn it. He forced himself to slow down, focusing on the tactile sensation of the magazine, the distinct click as it seated into the well. He racked the charging handle, the sharp clack echoing in the sudden lull of his own fire. He risked a glance at Maya. She was behind a large chunk of concrete, her eyes wide, a pistol clutched in her hand, her sidearm. Good, she wasn't useless. But her face was still pale, ghostly in the bioluminescent glow. The hunter watched, impassive, from the edge of the shadows. Its glowing eyes, twin points of malevolent crimson, were fixed on them, patiently waiting for the tendrils to wear them down. It was a macabre spectacle, a cosmic puppet show, and they were the unwilling performers. Then, from the tear itself, a new sound emerged, a deeper, richer thrumming, like a vast, unseen engine coming to life. The shimmering distortion in reality began to expand, growing wider, taller, its edges rippling with an unnerving fluidity. The air around it crackled with an ozone smell, hot and dry, like a lightning strike. The cloying sweetness intensified to a sickening degree, making Eris gag, a bitter taste rising in his throat. His vision swam, the tendrils blurring at the edges, their movements becoming a dizzying kaleidoscope of light. This was it, the main act. From the heart of the expanding tear, a new form began to coalesce. It wasn't another tendril, not exactly. It was a core, a central mass, larger and more defined than anything they had seen. It was roughly spherical, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, pulsating with a ferocious, blinding internal light that made the surrounding tendrils seem dull by comparison. This core wasn't just glowing, it was breathing, rhythmically expanding and contracting, a vast alien heart. And from its surface, where the tendrils connected, new ones began to sprout, smaller, faster, like parasitic offshoots. This was the source, the engine, the mother. The air pressure shifted dramatically, a sudden, powerful vacuum attempting to pull them towards the tear. Loose debris, small stones, even the fine dust on the ground, began to float, then accelerate towards the shimmering void, disappearing with a faint pop. Eris instinctively braced himself, digging his boots into the rubble, feeling the immense pull, the hungry maw of the tear itself. "Hold on," he roared, his voice barely audible above the escalating whine of the tear. He could feel his hair being pulled back, his clothes fluttering against his skin.
The force was immense, a primal suction. Petrov was struggling, one hand desperately clutching a piece of jagged metal, the other still fumbling with his M16, which was being ripped from his grasp. I can't hold," Petrov screamed, his face white with terror, his grip slipping. The M16 clattered to the ground, then slid inexorably towards the tear, consumed in a flash of light. "Maya, grab him!" Eris yelled, firing a desperate burst at the tendrils that were now actively trying to grapple them, not just sting them. He aimed for the core, emptying another magazine in a futile attempt. The bullets vanished into the shimmering surface, doing nothing. One of the newly sprouted tendrils, thinner and faster, wrapped around Petrov's leg. It was like a living whip, incredibly strong. Petrov shrieked, a sound of pure agony, as the tendril tightened, its minuscule needle-like teeth visible now, digging into his flesh. Eris could smell the sudden gush of fresh blood, a hot coppery tang mixing with the overwhelming sweetness of the tendrils and the burning ozone of the tear. "No!" Eris roared, tearing his eyes from the core to focus on Petrov. He fired a short burst into the tendril wrapped around Petrov's leg. The rounds tore through, creating shimmering wounds, but it held fast. The tendril was tough, incredibly resilient. Petrov was being pulled, slowly, agonizingly towards the tear, towards the pulsing core. His screams tore through the cacophony of the expanding tear and the tendril's high-pitched whine. Maya scrambled forward, a desperate animalistic cry escaping her lips. She dropped her pistol and grabbed Petrov's outstretched hand, digging her heels into the rubble, her body straining. But the tendril was stronger. Maya was losing ground, her face contorted with effort, her teeth gritted. Eris ripped his combat knife from its sheath. The cold steel felt solid, real in his trembling hand. He ignored the tendrils lashing at him, the burning sensation on his skin from the corrosive ichor. He launched himself forward, a desperate suicidal charge. He reached Petrov, ignoring the agonizing screams, and began hacking at the tendril wrapped around his leg. Slice, tear, grind. The blade bit into the alien flesh, but it was like cutting through thick, raw rubber reinforced with sinew. He could hear the grinding of the blade against something impossibly hard, even as it opened the tendril, releasing more of the clear, shimmering ichor.
The smell was overpowering, making his eyes water, his lungs burn. He felt dizzy, nauseous, his limbs growing heavy. Was it the fumes, the psychic attack, both? The tendril pulsed, resisting his efforts, pulling harder. Petrov was screaming, his eyes wide with fear and pain, the whites visible even through the alien glow. "Aris, leave me! Just run!" "Never!" Aris screamed back, the word a raw, guttural cry of defiance. He put all his weight into another hack, his muscles screaming in protest. The tendril finally gave, not severing, but weakening enough for a crucial second. Maya, with a guttural grunt, pulled Petrov free. The tendril recoiled, still partially attached, but Petrov was no longer being pulled towards the tear. But their reprieve was short-lived. The core within the tear pulsed violently, and from its surface, not new tendrils, but something else began to emerge. Something that squirmed and coiled, a grotesque mockery of life, wriggling free of the main mass. They were smaller, leech-like things, no bigger than Aris's forearm, but with multiple rows of tiny, chitinous legs and a mouth full of concentric rings of razor-sharp teeth. They dropped onto the ground, scores of them, hundreds, swarming like a plague of alien locusts. They moved with terrifying speed, clicking and rustling across the concrete, their tiny, unblinking eyes reflecting the lurid glow of the core. The chittering creatures, those that remained in the periphery, suddenly stirred, no longer just terrified, but driven to a new, desperate frenzy by the emergence of these smaller horrors. They began to advance, not towards Aris's group, but towards the leech-like swarm, a desperate counterattack, or perhaps a suicidal attempt to escape. The hunter, watching this new development, let out a low, satisfied growl.
It had unleashed its next wave. Aris stumbled back, dragging Petrov with Maya, his knife still clutched, dripping with alien ichor. He looked at the swarming leeches, then at the still expanding core, then at the hunter, impassive and deadly. Elias was gone. Petrov was wounded and breaking. Maya was hanging by a thread. And now, this. Tiny, fast, numerous, venomous horrors. His resolve, brittle before, now felt like a shattered pane of glass. But he would still fight. He would still make them pay. He just didn't know how many more blows his spirit could take before it too finally broke. The taste of blood and despair was thick in his mouth, a bitter epitaph to their doomed last stand. This wasn't the beginning of the end. This was the end, and it was going to be an agonizingly slow, violent, and utterly hopeless death. The taste of blood and despair was thick in Aris's mouth, a bitter epitaph to their doomed last stand. This wasn't the beginning of the end. This was the end.
This was the end. And it was going to be an agonizingly slow, violent, and utterly hopeless death. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, a cloying chemical sweetness mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the ever-present stench of decaying concrete and scorched earth. It clung to the back of his throat, made his eyes water even as he refused to blink. The lurid glow from the core, a sickly violet pulsating like a monstrous dying heart, cast long wavering shadows that danced with the movement of the newly spawned horrors. The leech-like creatures, those needle-toothed things that had erupted from the ground, were a nightmare given form. Scores of them, hundreds, maybe thousands, moved with an unnatural skittering grace, their segmented bodies clicking against the concrete like a swarm of forgotten mechanical toys. Their tiny, unblinking eyes, slick with a glistening, reflective sheen, caught the purple light and threw it back, 1,000 miniature, malevolent beacons. They were smaller than a man's hand, but their numbers, their speed, and the sheer overwhelming wrongness of their existence pressed in on Eris's frayed sanity. He could almost feel their venom, a phantom burning in his veins. His knife, still clutched tight, dripped with the ichor of a recently dispatched chittering beast. The alien blood was hot, greasy, and left a burning residue on his palm. He stumbled back, dragging Petrov, whose weight was now almost dead, a heavy anchor of broken bone and shattered will. Petrov's ragged breathing was a harsh counterpoint to the alien symphony of clicks and rustles, each gasp a desperate plea. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular spasms, and a fresh bloom of dark red had begun to spread across the front of his torn uniform, soaking into the grime and dust. His eyes, when Eris dared to glance, were wide, unfocused, reflecting nothing but the relentless alien light. Maya, a wraith of a woman, hung between Eris and Petrov, her head lolling, her own shallow breaths almost imperceptible above the din. Her skin was ashen, her lips blue, and the tremor that ran through her slight frame was not from cold, but from sheer exhaustion and the crushing weight of impending death. She was a breath away from slipping into the abyss. Elias was gone, devoured, extinguished. A bitter, cold knot tightened in Eris's gut, tasting like bile and ash. The chittering creatures that had been held at bay, those peripheral horrors that had stalked him from the fringes, suddenly stirred with a renewed, terrible energy. It wasn't the blind terror Eris had expected. Instead, it was a desperate, almost suicidal surge. They advanced, not towards Eris's group, but towards the swarm of leeches, their multi-jointed legs scuttling faster, their mandibles clicking with furious intent. A strange, high-pitched screech tore through the air from their ranks, a sound of utter panic and rage. Were they attacking, defending, trying to escape through the nascent chaos? Eris didn't know, didn't care. All he knew was that a fresh wave of alien-on-alien violence was about to erupt, and they were caught squarely in the middle of it. The hunter, an obsidian monolith of predatory grace, remained impassive, almost serene, amidst the escalating maelstrom. It stood by the expanding core, its alien eyes tracking the frenzied ballet of its unleashed horrors, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in its chest, a sound of satisfaction, of absolute control. It had orchestrated this final, horrifying symphony of death. It was enjoying the show. "Eris! Eris!" Petrov's voice was a ragged whisper, a ghost of his former booming self. His hand, slick with his own blood, feebly clutched Eris's sleeve. Can't do it." Eris pushed down the rising tide of nausea. "We don't stop, Petrov, not until we stop breathing." The words tasted hollow, even to him. He hefted Petrov's arm over his shoulder, adjusting his grip on Maya. His own shoulder screamed in protest, every muscle burning, a deep, persistent ache that had burrowed into his very bones. His lungs burned with the metallic, acrid air. The first clash between the two alien species was an explosion of sound and viscera. The larger chittering creatures, their hardened carapaces formidable, slammed into the swarming leeches. There was a sickening crunch, a wet tear, as mandibles snapped, legs tore, and needle-like teeth latched on. The leeches, despite their size, were ferociously effective. They climbed, burrowed, and swarmed, covering the larger creatures in a writhing, pulsing carpet of glistening dark bodies. Horrific screeches rent the air as the chittering creatures thrashed, trying to dislodge their parasitic attackers. But the leeches clung with impossible tenacity, their tiny bodies pulsating as they seemingly drained their hosts. The ground vibrated with the impact, a low hum resonating from the core that seemed to worm its way directly into Eris's skull. He saw one of the chittering creatures, fully engulfed in the leech swarm, collapse to the ground, its thrashing slowing, its multiple legs twitching in a dying dance. A cloud of black, dust-like particles, remnants of its dissolving form, billowed into the air. The leeches detached, leaving behind a husk, and then, impossibly, more of them seemed to emerge from the dying creature's remains, regenerating, multiplying, a self-sustaining wave of pure, concentrated horror.
God! Maya's voice was a faint, broken sigh. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with unimaginable terror, fixated on the evolving battlefield. They're eating them, and growing. Eris didn't need her to tell him. He could see it, taste the impossibility of it. This wasn't just a battle, it was an infestation, an assimilation. The leeches were a biological weapon designed for total eradication, for consumption and conversion. He pulled them back further, his eyes scanning desperately for any kind of cover, any kind of escape, even if it was just a temporary reprieve before the inevitable. The concrete around the core was a jagged wasteland, twisted rebar jutting like broken bones. A section of a crumbled wall, perhaps, a temporary shield. But the ground was slick with alien fluids, treacherous underfoot. Suddenly, a chittering creature, its carapace scarred, one leg visibly broken, shrieked and lunged, not at the leeches, but directly at Eris's group. It was trying to escape the swarm, and Eris was in its path. Its multifaceted eyes were wide with a desperate, primal fear that mirrored his own. Eris roared, a raw, animal sound of defiance. He pushed Maya and Petrov behind a section of half-collapsed concrete pipe, then spun, bringing his knife up. The creature was fast, faster than he expected, a whirlwind of desperation. He felt the crushing impact against his shoulder, the sickening pop as something gave. Pain, sharp and white-hot, lanced through him, but he ignored it, his adrenaline-fueled rage overriding his nerves. He plunged the knife into the creature's soft underbelly, twisting the blade, feeling the rough texture of internal organs give way. A gush of dark, viscous ichor erupted, spraying his face, hot and stinging. He recoiled, gasping, but held on, driving the blade deeper, twisting, until the alien collapsed, twitching, then still. He ripped the knife free, the sound a wet slur. His shoulder throbbed, a dull, insistent ache. His uniform was soaked in alien blood, the smell of which was now nauseatingly sweet. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing the ichor, tasting it, bitter, metallic, utterly alien. "Eris," Petrov coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Look out!" Too late. The leeches, a ripple of black movement, too fast to track, had broken off from the main engagement. Several dozen of them, perhaps 50, were scuttling straight for their meager cover. They clicked, rustled, their unblinking eyes fixed on their new prey. Eris didn't hesitate. He pulled out the empty sidearm, not for its non-existent bullets, but for its weight, its blunt force. He had no choice. He had to give them every last second. "Get behind me!" he yelled, his voice hoarse, cracking. He positioned himself in the narrow opening of the broken pipe, knife in one hand, pistol in the other. He was a barrier, a human shield, his body the last line of defense. The first leech skittered over the edge of the pipe, its needle teeth glistening. Aris brought the pistol down with all his might, a sickening squelch as it met the creature's segmented body. It burst, a spray of blackish-green fluid, but immediately another took its place, then another. They moved with a horrifying, single-minded focus. He swung the knife, a blur of desperate motion, hacking, slashing. Each successful strike was a small victory, a momentary reprieve, but their numbers were overwhelming. One latched onto his boot, its teeth instantly piercing the thick leather, sending a jolt of burning pain up his leg. He screamed, kicked wildly, dislodging it, crushing it under his heel. Another tried to climb his leg. He smashed it with the pistol butt. The sound of their clicking, their rustling, was a suffocating shroud, pressing in from all sides. Petrov, despite his wounds, let out a choked cry. He fumbled for his own sidearm, surprisingly still holstered. His hands trembled, unable to fully grasp it. "Damn it, can't feel my fingers." "Stay down," Aris roared, sweat and alien blood stinging his eyes. He felt a sudden sharp prickling on his forearm. He glanced down. A leech, somehow, had gotten through, burrowing its head into his flesh. The pain was immediate, a fiery burn that spread rapidly. He screamed, tearing it off, the tiny fangs ripping at his skin, leaving behind a small, bleeding wound that immediately felt hot, swollen, venomous. He crushed it with his fist, the sensation sickening. The world began to blur at the edges, his vision tunneled. The venom, or just the sheer exhaustion, was taking its toll. He was slowing down. The leeches were too many. They were a tide, an unstoppable wave. Suddenly, a wet gurgle, a strangled gasp from behind him. A wrist spun, heart hammering. Maya. A leech, impossibly, had found a way to her. It was latched onto her neck, its body pulsing, engorged. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, her mouth agape in a silent scream. A thin trickle of dark blood ran down her pale throat. Her body twitched, convulsed, then slumped against the cold concrete. "Maya!" Aris screamed, a sound torn from his very soul. He lunged, tearing the leech from her, crushing it, but it was too late. Her eyes, still open, stared blankly at the pulsing violet core, reflecting its lurid glow for the last time. Her chest was still. Her breathing had ceased. Grief, raw and incandescent, surged through Eris, momentarily eclipsing all fear, all pain. He looked at Maya, then at the swarming leeches, then at the hunter, impassive by the core, still watching. A red haze descended over his vision. He had nothing left to lose. Nothing. He stood, abandoning his futile defense of the pipe. He had protected no one. They were all going to die. But he would make them pay. He would make it pay. "You fucker!" Eris roared, a guttural primal sound. He pointed his bloodied knife, not at the leeches, but at the hunter. He charged, a broken man fueled by pure, unadulterated rage and despair, a solitary, defiant figure against an impossible nightmare. The leeches parted before him, as if recognizing his singular focus. The chittering creatures, locked in their own gruesome battle, ignored him. All eyes, it seemed, were on the man who dared to challenge the architect of his doom. He ran, his legs burning, his shoulders screaming, the venom in his arm spreading a numbing fire through his veins. The air grew hotter, thicker, the hum of the core a deafening roar in his ears. The lurid violet light pulsed faster, casting his charging form in a grotesque, flickering silhouette. The hunter watched him come, its alien head cocked slightly, as if in mild curiosity. It made no move to retreat, no gesture of defense. It simply waited. Eris covered the ground, each step an agony, each breath a struggle. He was close now, close enough to see the minute details of the hunter's obsidian skin, the subtle shifts of its alien musculature beneath. Its eyes, deep pools of black, held no emotion, no recognition, just an ancient, predatory intelligence. He was going to die. He knew it, but he would take a piece of it with him. He would make it bleed. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Eris lunged, the knife a gleaming arc of defiance in the oppressive purple light. He aimed for the hunter's chest, for its heart, for whatever passed for a vital organ in its horrific anatomy. The hunter moved with astonishing, terrifying speed. It was a blur of black, too fast for human eyes to follow. Eris felt a sudden, crushing impact, not of flesh meeting blade, but of something hard and unyielding slamming into his chest. His ribs cracked with a sickening sound. The air rushed from his lungs in a painful gasp. He was airborne, lifted from his feet by an invisible force, his momentum abruptly reversed. He spun through the air, disoriented, his head snapping back. The knife flew from his grasp, clattering uselessly against the concrete. He saw the hunter, no longer standing by the core, but a few feet away, its massive arm extended, one of its taloned hands a blur. It had merely flicked him aside, a fly, a nuisance. Eris hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. Pain exploded in his chest, a searing inferno. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and tasted blood, hot and coppery, filling his mouth. He lay there, gasping, broken, staring up at the pulsating core, the source of all this horror. The hunter slowly approached him, its footsteps heavy, deliberate. It stopped a few feet away, casting a long, skeletal shadow over Eris. It looked down at him, its alien eyes unreadable. There was no triumph, no malice, just observation. The observation of an apex predator over its defeated prey. Eris tried to move, to crawl, to push himself up, but his body refused. His chest burned, his limbs felt like lead. The venom in his arm throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that was now overshadowed by the exquisite agony in his ribs. He couldn't fight, he couldn't move, he couldn't even stand. He was utterly, completely broken. He stared back at the hunter, defiance still burning in his eyes, even as his vision grew dim, even as the world began to fade around the edges. He coughed again, blood bubbling to his lips. He could taste the metallic tang of his own life ebbing away, the bitter iron mixed with the acrid scent of the core, the sweet chemical smell of alien destruction. The hunter lowered its head slightly, a subtle shift. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised one of its massive, taloned feet. It was not a stomp, not an act of violence. It was simply placement. A final, crushing weight. Aris felt the shadow fall over him. He heard Petrov's last, desperate, rattling breath somewhere in the distance. He saw the core, pulsing, expanding, its violet light growing brighter, consuming everything. He felt the cold, hard press of the concrete against his back. He felt the profound, chilling silence that descended as the chaos of the leech swarm and the chittering creatures seemed to recede, as if in deference to this final, personal annihilation. He closed his eyes. The last sensation was the taste of his own blood, thick and metallic, coating his tongue, the cold certainty of death, and the lingering, suffocating presence of the alien horror that had utterly, completely won. The world went dark, and the hum of the core was the last sound he ever heard, an eternal, terrible thrum in the silence of his dying mind. The core continued to pulse, its malevolent light spreading, casting a sickening glow over the ruins of the containment zone, over the dead, over the triumphant, unmoving form of the hunter. The leeches continued their relentless assimilation, consuming and multiplying. The chittering creatures, broken and defeated, scattered or fell to the parasites. The CDC Containment had become a nursery, a breeding ground, a monument to humanity's failure. And as the violet light bled into the encroaching dawn, a new day broke over a world utterly unprepared for the horrors that had just begun to awaken. The panic had just started, and no one was left to stop it.